Your card has been declined, sir. The waiter said it quietly, but in a restaurant full of business executives and polished wine glasses, quiet somehow felt louder. Ethan Whitmore froze with his black credit card still hovering over the leather check presenter. Across the table, his clients exchanged awkward glances while Vanessa slowly lowered her champagne glass. I wasn't there to see it myself, of course. I heard about it later. But I can still picture the exact expression my son must have had in that moment. The confusion first. Then disbelief. Then panic. Because according to Ethan, that card had no limit. For nearly 11 years, neither did I. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and 3 weeks before my son's perfect little dinner fell apart, I woke up alone in a hospital room after a car accident that changed my life in ways I never expected. Not because of the injuries. Those healed slowly. It was what I overheard afterward that truly broke something inside me. Or maybe it opened my eyes for the first time in years. The morning Ethan's card stopped working, I was sitting quietly on the screened porch of a small rental cottage in Bar Harbor, Maine. The Atlantic breeze carried the scent of saltwater and pine through the air, and for the first time in months, my coffee tasted peaceful. My phone rang 3 times before I picked up. Ethan sounded breathless. Frantic. Mom, something's wrong with the accounts. I took another sip of coffee before answering. Good morning to you too. Mom, this isn't funny, he snapped. The transfers stopped. The mortgage payment bounced. Vanessa's card got declined at the marina this morning. Did the bank freeze something? I looked out toward the gray-blue water beyond the trees. A gull drifted across the sky. No, I said calmly. I froze it. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that reveals more truth than words ever could. What are you talking about? He finally whispered. His voice sounded smaller now. Younger somehow. I closed my eyes for a moment and leaned back in the porch chair. 3 weeks earlier, I had still believed my son loved me more than my money. Funny how quickly life corrects certain illusions. I thought I was just a burden now, I told him softly. Isn't that what you said after my accident? He inhaled sharply. In the distance, I could hear Vanessa speaking in the background. Fast. Nervous. Angry. Ethan lowered his voice. Mom, don't do this right now. We're in the middle of something. I almost smiled at that. Because for years, I had always made sure Ethan never had to be in the middle of something. When his first business failed at 32, I refinanced my home to help him recover. When Vanessa wanted private school for the children, I quietly paid the tuition every semester. When they upgraded to that enormous colonial house outside Hartford with the marble kitchen and heated driveway, it was my retirement account that covered the down payment gap. Ethan used to call me every Sunday back then. Not because he needed money. At least that's what I told myself. After Harold died 6 years ago, I tried to hold the family together the way wives and mothers from my generation were taught to do. Quietly. Gracefully. Without becoming a problem for anyone else. Even when the phone calls became shorter. Even when holidays felt rushed. Even when Vanessa started speaking to me with that careful politeness people use with strangers they don't particularly like. I ignored all of it. Mothers are good at ignoring things that hurt them. But accidents have a strange way of stripping life down to its truth. Mine happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in late October. I had been driving home from the grocery store when another driver slid through an intersection and clipped the passenger side of my sedan. Nothing dramatic. No shattered glass flying through the air. No terrifying movie scene. Just the violent jolt of metal against metal and the sudden realization that my hands were trembling too hard to grip the steering wheel afterward. The doctors kept me overnight for observation because of my blood pressure and a minor fracture in my wrist. I remember waking sometime after midnight to the sound of voices outside my hospital room. Ethan and Vanessa had finally arrived. At first, hearing my son's voice comforted me. Then I heard Vanessa sigh heavily. "We can't keep doing this, Ethan." Her voice was low, but the hallway was quiet. "Your mother needs more help than we can give her." Ethan didn't answer immediately. "Maybe assisted living would be better," Vanessa continued. "For everyone. For everyone. Not for me. Not for my recovery. For everyone." I stayed perfectly still in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles while something cold settled into my chest. Then Ethan said the words I still hear at night sometimes. "I know." Just two simple words. Quiet. Tired. Defeated. But they changed everything I thought I knew about my son. Because there are moments in life when a person accidentally tells you exactly who they are. And if you're wise enough, you listen. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. I remember staring at the pale beige curtain beside my bed while the heart monitor beeped softly somewhere to my left. It was nearly 3 a.m, but sleep would not come back after what I had overheard in the hallway. I kept replaying Ethan's voice in my mind. "I know." Just 2 words. Quiet enough that another person might have missed the meaning hidden inside them. But mothers hear things differently when it comes to their children. We hear disappointment when others hear exhaustion. We hear distance when others hear politeness. And that night, for the first time in my life, I heard resignation in my son's voice when he talked about me. The next morning, Ethan arrived carrying a paper cup of coffee and a blueberry muffin from the hospital cafe. He smiled when he walked into the room, but it was the kind of smile people practice before funerals and difficult conversations. Careful. Measured. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he pulled the visitor chair closer to my bed. I adjusted the thin blanket over my legs slowly. "Old," I said with a small laugh. He smiled again, relieved that I sounded normal. "The doctor said you are lucky," he replied. "A fractured wrist at your age could have been much worse." At your age. Funny how children start measuring your life in years once they begin seeing you as fragile. I nodded and looked down at my hands. The skin seemed thinner lately. Pale blue veins beneath wrinkles I barely noticed before Harold died. "Where is Vanessa?" I asked. Ethan hesitated for half a second too long. "She had to take Lily to dance practice." Of course she did. There was always somewhere else Vanessa needed to be when it involved me. I did not say that aloud. Instead, I smiled politely and broke the muffin in half even though I was not hungry. Ethan spent most of the visit checking emails on his phone between conversations. Every few minutes, the screen lit up against his face. Mortgage reminders. Work messages. Calendar alerts. The life I had helped build for him never seemed to stop demanding more. "You should probably stay with us for a little while after discharge," he said suddenly without looking up from the phone. "Just until you get stronger." I studied him carefully then. Ethan always spoke faster when an idea belonged to Vanessa first. "Only for a little while?" I asked softly. He finally looked at me. "Mom, do not make this difficult." Difficult. Another interesting word. When children become adults, parents slowly transform into responsibilities. Then responsibilities become inconveniences. And eventually inconveniences become burdens people discuss in quiet hospital hallways after midnight. I stayed with Ethan and Vanessa for 9 days after leaving the hospital. Their house sat in a gated subdivision outside Hartford where every lawn looked professionally trimmed and every porch had matching seasonal decorations. The kind of neighborhood where people smiled politely but kept their garage doors closed. Vanessa had converted the downstairs office into a temporary bedroom for me. She placed a small vase of grocery store flowers beside the bed and folded fresh towels neatly across the comforter. To anyone visiting, it would have looked thoughtful. Generous even. But warmth is difficult to fake over time. You feel its absence in the smallest moments. The pause before someone answers your question. The sigh they think you cannot hear. The way conversations stop when you enter a room. On the second evening, I came downstairs quietly around 10 o'clock because my wrist medication was making my mouth dry. The kitchen lights were dim except for the soft glow above the stove. Ethan and Vanessa were sitting at the island whispering over a stack of papers. Vanessa noticed me first. Her expression changed instantly. The papers disappeared into a folder before I reached the refrigerator. Could not sleep, she asked brightly. Too much tea before bed, I replied. Ethan forced a tired smile. There were dark circles under his eyes now. He looked older than 39 suddenly. I poured myself a glass of water slowly while Vanessa tapped her manicured nails against the countertop. We have been talking about logistics, she said casually. Just trying to figure out what kind of support you might need long term. Long term. Another phrase people use when they no longer see you returning to your old life. I still live independently, I reminded her gently. Before the accident, yes, Vanessa said quickly. But things change. Ethan stared down at the paperwork without speaking. I looked at my son for several seconds, waiting for him to say something comforting. Something loyal. Instead he rubbed his forehead and sighed. Maybe we should start considering options before another emergency happens. I felt something settle heavily inside my chest then. Not anger. Anger is loud. This was quieter than that. Colder. It was the slow realization that my future was being discussed like a financial spreadsheet while I stood 3 feet away holding a glass of water in my own son's kitchen. And somehow the hardest part was not Vanessa speaking to me that way. It was Ethan allowing it. The next few days settled into a strange routine that felt more like visiting distant relatives than staying with family. Every morning I woke before everyone else and sat quietly in the downstairs office watching pale autumn sunlight creep across the backyard through the narrow windows. The trees behind the property had already turned orange and gold, and leaves drifted across the grass like little pieces of paper. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, the house carried a tension beneath its polished surfaces that never fully disappeared. Vanessa moved around me carefully, the same way. People walk around expensive furniture they are afraid to damage. Always polite. Always smiling. But never warm. One morning she placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of me at the kitchen island and said, "Dr. Reynolds called yesterday. He thinks you should avoid driving for at least another month." I stirred the oatmeal slowly. That makes sense. It might actually be safer if Ethan handled your errands permanently, she added casually while scrolling through her phone. Especially banking and bills. I looked up then. I have managed my own finances for 40 years. Vanessa smiled without lifting her eyes from the screen. Of course. I just mean things are probably harder now. Harder now. Everything suddenly seemed to fall into that category after the accident. My memory. My independence. My future. Even simple opinions I had held my entire life were treated like fragile little things that needed supervision. Ethan barely noticed it happening. Or maybe he did and chose silence because silence was easier. That Thursday afternoon, I decided to fold some laundry while Vanessa picked up the children from school. I moved slowly because of my wrist, carefully pairing socks at the dining room table while soft instrumental music played through the ceiling speakers. Ethan had left his laptop open beside a stack of mail near the end of the table. I was not snooping. At least I did not think I was. But a notification appeared across the screen while I folded one of Lily's sweaters. Payment failed. The message disappeared quickly, but another one followed seconds later from what looked like a mortgage company. Then another from a credit card account. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I understood the details, but because something about the urgency of the notifications unsettled me. Ethan and Vanessa lived carefully curated lives. Luxury SUVs in the driveway. Designer coats. Ski vacations every winter. Private school tuition for both children. Yet suddenly I remembered the tension in Ethan's face lately. The late-night whispers. The paperwork disappearing whenever I entered the room. My chest tightened slightly. Later that evening, Ethan came home looking exhausted. He loosened his tie while Vanessa poured him a glass of wine before he even sat down. Long day? I asked quietly from the sofa. He rubbed his eyes. You could say that. Vanessa gave him a quick look before speaking. We were just discussing refinancing options. Ethan immediately glanced toward me. It is nothing you need to worry about, Mom. Worry. Another interesting word. I had spent decades worrying about Ethan. About his asthma attacks as a little boy. About bullies in middle school. About his first failed business venture after college. About the crushing grief he carried after Harold died. Mothers worry so naturally that eventually people forget we can also notice things. That night I could not sleep again. Around midnight, I heard footsteps upstairs and the faint sound of voices drifting down the hallway vent near my room. At first I tried to ignore them. Then I heard my name. We cannot keep covering everything forever, Vanessa whispered sharply. If she needs long-term care, where is that money supposed to come from? Ethan sounded tired. The investments are still there. For now, Vanessa replied. But if medical bills start piling up, the sentence faded before I could hear the rest clearly. I sat upright in bed staring into the darkness. Medical bills. Investments. Covering everything. A strange feeling crept over me then. Not fear exactly. More like awareness. Like stepping into a room and suddenly realizing people have been discussing you long before you arrived. The next morning, Ethan drove me to a follow-up appointment with my orthopedic doctor. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while traffic crawled along Interstate 84. For most of the drive, Ethan stayed quiet except for occasional complaints about work calls and rising insurance costs. Then, almost casually, he said, "Have you thought any more about assisted living communities?" I turned slowly toward him. "You seem very interested in getting rid of me lately." The word surprised both of us. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel immediately. "That is not fair." "Is it not?" He exhaled heavily through his nose. "Mom, this is exactly what I mean. Everything becomes emotional with you." Emotional. I stared out the passenger window at the blurred gray sky beyond the highway barriers. There was a time when Ethan used to call me every single day after Harold passed away because he worried I was lonely. Now my feelings were being discussed like inconveniences. "I do not want to be a burden," I said softly after a long silence. Ethan relaxed slightly when I said those words. I noticed that immediately. "Nobody is saying you are," he replied. But he did not sound convincing anymore. And for the first time in my life, I started wondering whether my son loved me at all without the safety of everything I provided. After that conversation in the car, something inside me became quieter. Not calmer. Just quieter in the way winter fields become quiet after the last harvest. Empty. Exposed. I stopped trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. Mothers spend years softening reality to protect the people they love. We excuse coldness as stress. We explain away neglect as busyness. We tell ourselves children drift because life becomes complicated. But eventually the truth sits in front of you long enough that denying it starts to feel foolish. 2 days later, Vanessa asked if I could stay downstairs while they hosted dinner guests. "It is a work thing for Ethan," she explained while arranging white candles along the dining room table. "A few investors and their wives. Nothing exciting." I nodded and returned to the downstairs office without argument. Through the vents and floorboards above me, I could hear faint laughter, silverware clinking against plates, and soft jazz music playing somewhere in the background. The house smelled like rosemary chicken and expensive perfume. Around 8:30, I realized I had left my reading glasses upstairs beside the guest bathroom sink. I climbed the staircase slowly because of my wrist, careful not to interrupt the dinner. Voices drifted clearly from the dining room before I even reached the hallway. "My mother has always been generous," Ethan was saying with a small laugh. "Sometimes too generous." Someone chuckled politely. Then a woman asked, "Does she still live alone?" There was a brief pause. "Not anymore," Vanessa answered smoothly before Ethan could speak. "After her accident, we realized she really cannot manage independently." Cannot manage independently. I stopped moving halfway up the staircase. "That must be difficult," another guest said kindly. Vanessa lowered her voice slightly, but I still heard every word. "Honestly, it has been a major adjustment financially too. Medical issues at that age become complicated fast. Financially." I stood completely still in the dark hallway while warmth from the dining room lights spilled across the hardwood floor nearby. Something about hearing myself discussed like a household expense made my stomach turn. Ethan spoke next, quieter this time. "We are just trying to figure out what makes sense long term." One of the men laughed lightly. "Welcome to middle age. First college tuition, then aging parents." Everyone laughed softly after that. Everyone except Ethan. I waited for him to say something. Anything. "She is my mother. She supported me my entire life. She is not a burden." But nothing came. Only the sound of wine glasses touching and someone complimenting the food. I turned around before anyone saw me standing there and walked slowly back downstairs. My hands trembled slightly by the time I reached the office again. Not from anger. From humiliation. There is something deeply painful about hearing strangers discuss your existence like a future problem that needs budgeting. I sat quietly on the edge of the bed for a long time afterward, staring at the carpet pattern beneath my feet. Then my eyes drifted toward the bookshelf beside the desk. Framed between two decorative boxes sat a photograph Ethan had placed there years earlier. It was from his college graduation. Harold stood proudly beside him wearing the same navy suit he always saved for important occasions, one arm around Ethan's shoulder while I smiled beside them holding flowers. Ethan looked so happy in that picture. So hopeful. Harold used to say our son had a soft heart. "Ethan feels things deeply," he would tell me whenever our son struggled through disappointments growing up. Maybe that was true once. Or maybe life slowly hardens people when comfort becomes entitlement instead of gratitude. The following afternoon, while Vanessa took Lily and Mason to soccer practice, I decided to organize some paperwork inside my overnight bag. My bank statements had arrived by mail earlier that week, forwarded from my home. Normally I barely glanced at them beyond checking balances. Harold always handled investments before he passed away, and afterward I simply maintained the routines we built together. Automatic payments. Monthly transfers. Tuition accounts. But now certain phrases from the past week kept circling in my mind. Financial adjustment. Long-term. Investments. I sat carefully at the desk and opened the statements one by one beneath the yellow lamplight. At first everything looked normal. Utility bills. Insurance deductions. Charitable donations Harold and I had supported for years. Then I noticed the recurring transfers. Whitmore Educational Trust. $12,000 every semester. Mason and Lily's private school tuition. I already knew about those payments. Harold and I had offered to help years ago. But below that sat another recurring transfer. $7,800 monthly. Property management account. I frowned slightly. Another transfer followed 3 days later each month. Luxury vehicle lease services. Then another. Home equity adjustment support. My chest tightened. I adjusted my glasses and leaned closer to the papers. The amounts blurred together for a moment beneath the warm desk lamp. Mortgage supplements. Insurance shortfall assistance. Credit balance protection. I slowly realized what I was looking at. I was not occasionally helping Ethan and Vanessa. I was quietly financing their entire lifestyle. The vacations. The luxury cars. The oversized house with imported marble countertops. Even the country club membership Harold once joked was too fancy for sensible people. My fingers rested against the edge of the statement while silence filled the downstairs office around me. Upstairs, I could hear the dryer humming faintly somewhere down the hallway. Ordinary domestic sounds. Ordinary life. But suddenly everything looked different. Because for the first time, I understood something that should have terrified me far more than the accident itself. If the money stopped, I did not know whether my son would still want me in his life at all. That night I barely slept. I lay awake staring at the faint strip of light beneath the downstairs door while numbers drifted endlessly through my mind. $7,800. Mortgage supplements. Vehicle leases. Insurance support. For years I had believed I was helping Ethan occasionally during difficult moments. A tuition payment here. A business setback there. A grandmother helping her family stay comfortable. That was how I explained it to myself every month when another transfer cleared quietly from my account. But what I discovered at that desk was something entirely different. I was not supporting my son. I was sustaining an entire lifestyle built on the assumption that I would always say yes. The next morning, I moved through the kitchen carefully, pretending nothing had changed. Vanessa stood beside the espresso machine in cream-colored workout clothes while scrolling through vacation listings on her tablet. "Look at this place in St. Lucia," she said casually to Ethan while I poured myself tea. "The resort has private beach cabanas and oceanfront suites." Ethan glanced at the screen distractedly. "Maybe after the refinance goes through." Vanessa sighed dramatically. "We deserve one good vacation after the stress of this year." Stress of this year. I stirred honey slowly into my tea without speaking. It fascinated me suddenly how naturally they discussed luxury while treating my existence like a financial inconvenience. Later that afternoon, Claire Benson came to visit. Claire and I had known each other since our husbands worked together decades ago, back when Ethan still played Little League baseball and Harold grilled hamburgers every Sunday afternoon in our backyard. Claire arrived carrying a paper bag of cinnamon scones from the bakery we both loved downtown. The moment she stepped into the downstairs office, her expression softened. "Margaret," she said quietly, embracing me carefully. "You look tired." I almost laughed at how kind those words felt after weeks inside that house. Claire sat beside me near the small window while rain tapped softly against the glass outside. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The weather. Her grandson starting college. A neighbor selling their home. Normal conversation. Comfortable conversation. The kind where you do not feel like someone is evaluating the cost of your presence. Eventually Claire lowered her voice slightly. "I ran into Ethan at the country club last week." Something in her tone made me look up immediately. "Oh." She hesitated. I almost did not mention it. I waited quietly. Claire sighed and folded her hands in her lap. "He seemed stressed. Financially stressed." My chest tightened almost imperceptibly. "Did he say that?" "Not directly." Claire looked uncomfortable now. "But he joked that if you ever stopped helping them, the entire house of cards might collapse." The room became very still around me. "House of cards," I repeated softly. Claire nodded reluctantly. I do not think he realized how awful it sounded. I looked down at my teacup for several seconds. Steam curled upward slowly into the dim light. "Did Vanessa say anything?" Claire gave a short humorless laugh. "Vanessa mostly talked about property taxes and private school costs." Her voice softened afterward. "Margaret, I hope you know this is not normal. I smiled faintly. I am beginning to realize that. Claire reached across and touched my hand gently. Harold would hate this. Hearing my husband's name nearly undid me for a moment. Harold had always believed generosity should strengthen families. He used to tell Ethan, money means nothing if people you love are struggling. Maybe that was our mistake. We raised a son who learned how to receive help without ever learning the dignity of refusing too much of it. After Claire left, I sat alone for a long time listening to the rain. Upstairs I could hear Vanessa vacuuming while Mason practiced piano somewhere down the hallway. Ordinary suburban sounds. But now every sound carried a strange distance to it, as if I had already become invisible inside their lives. Around 6 o'clock, Ethan came downstairs looking unusually tense. "Mom, do you still have Harold's old financial advisor?" he asked casually. I looked up from my book slowly. "Daniel Harper." "Yes." Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets. "You should probably let me start helping with some of that stuff moving forward." I said nothing. He continued carefully. "I just mean, with your health situation now, it would probably be easier if I had access to certain accounts in case of emergencies." Emergencies. There it was again. That soft polished language people use when they are trying to disguise control as concern. I closed my book gently on my lap. "Have I ever given you reason to believe I cannot manage my affairs?" Ethan immediately looked uncomfortable. "That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" He exhaled sharply and looked toward the staircase as though hoping Vanessa might rescue him from the conversation. "Mom, why are you making everything difficult lately?" "Difficult lately?" I stared at my son quietly. The little boy who once cried when he accidentally stepped on a bird's wing in our backyard because he could not bear the thought of causing pain. The teenager who hugged me after Harold's first surgery and whispered, "I do not know what I would do without you." Somewhere between then and now, gratitude had curdled into expectation. "I am not making things difficult," I said softly. "I am simply paying attention for the first time in a very long while." Ethan frowned slightly at that, but before he could answer, I looked away toward the rain-streaked window. Because deep down, something inside me had already started changing. Quietly. Completely. And for the first time since the accident, I no longer felt frightened by that change at all. The following Monday morning, I asked Ethan if he could drive me to Daniel Harper's office. I kept my voice calm while buttering toast at the kitchen counter. "I need to review some paperwork with him," I said casually. Ethan barely looked up from his phone. "Can it wait a few weeks?" "No," he sighed softly, the way people sigh when an elderly relative insists on something inconvenient. "I have meetings all afternoon." Vanessa entered the kitchen at that exact moment carrying a gym bag over one shoulder. "What paperwork?" she asked lightly. "Just investments," I replied. "Insurance things." Harold always preferred annual reviews. Vanessa exchanged a quick glance with Ethan so subtle they probably thought I missed it. But once you begin noticing things, it becomes impossible to stop. "I can reschedule spin class," she offered carefully. "I could take you." "That is kind," I said with a small smile. But Daniel already arranged a car service. Another brief silence followed. Tiny. Sharp. Almost invisible. Vanessa recovered first. "Well, that sounds nice." But her voice had tightened slightly around the edges. Daniel Harper's office overlooked the Connecticut River from the top floor of an old brick building downtown. Harold trusted him for nearly 20 years because Daniel possessed something rare in financial advisors. He spoke plainly. No performance. No manipulation. Just facts. When I entered his office that afternoon, Daniel stood immediately and walked around his desk to hug me gently. His silver hair looked thinner than I remembered, and his reading glasses hung low on his nose now. "Margaret," he said warmly. I was worried after hearing about the accident. I am healing, I replied. Slowly. He studied my face for a moment longer than usual. And everything else? Funny how old friends can ask entire questions without finishing a sentence. I sat carefully in the leather chair across from his desk and folded my hands together. Daniel, I said quietly, I need you to tell me exactly how much financial support Ethan has been receiving from me over the years. His expression changed immediately. Not surprise. More like concern. Daniel removed his glasses slowly. Margaret, please. He hesitated before opening a thick file cabinet beside his desk. For several minutes, only the sound of papers turning filled the room. Outside the tall windows, gray clouds drifted low above the river. Finally Daniel placed several folders neatly across the desk between us. You asked me years ago not to interfere in family decisions, he said gently. So I honored that. I nodded once. I know. He opened the first folder. Carefully. Since Harold passed away, there have been regular monthly transfers supporting Ethan and Vanessa's household expenses. He slid the statements toward me one at a time. Mortgage supplements. Tuition payments. Vehicle leases. Vacation property deposits. Business recovery loans that were never repaid. Country club dues. Health insurance assistance. Even luxury furniture financing. The numbers blurred together after a while. How long? I asked quietly. Daniel looked down at the paperwork before answering. Nearly 11 years in total. 11 years. I stared silently at the river beyond the windows. Ethan had been 38 years old last month. A grown man with children of his own. A man who hosted business dinners in tailored suits and discussed investment opportunities over expensive whiskey while his mother quietly paid the bills behind the curtain. Daniel's voice softened. Margaret, there is something else you should know. I turned back toward him slowly. He folded his hands together. 3 months ago, Ethan contacted me asking questions about long-term care trusts and property restructuring. My stomach tightened. What kind of restructuring? Daniel hesitated carefully. He wanted to understand how your assets could eventually be consolidated into family-controlled accounts if your medical condition worsened. Family-controlled accounts. Such elegant words for something that suddenly felt deeply ugly. Did he mention assisted living? I asked. Daniel's silence answered before his mouth did. Yes, he admitted quietly. I leaned back slowly in the chair. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Somewhere outside the office, a phone rang faintly. A printer hummed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary business. Yet it felt as though my entire understanding of motherhood had cracked open quietly in that room. The accident scared them, Daniel continued gently. But not for the reasons you hoped. I closed my eyes briefly. That sentence landed with painful precision because deep down I already knew it was true. Ethan had not looked terrified beside my hospital bed because he thought he might lose me. He looked terrified because losing me meant losing access to everything I provided. The realization should have shattered me. Instead, something unexpected happened. I felt calm. Not happy. Not vindictive. Just calm in the way oceans become calm before winter storms arrive. Daniel watched me carefully. What would you like to do? I opened my eyes and looked down at the folders spread across his desk. 11 years of quiet dependence disguised as love. 11 years of saying yes because I believed helping family meant security. Loyalty. Gratitude. But gratitude had long since disappeared from Ethan's life. Only expectation remained. I folded the statements neatly back into their folders and slid them toward Daniel. I want every automatic transfer reviewed immediately, I said softly. My voice sounded steady now. Stronger than it had in months. Daniel studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. All right. I looked back out the tall windows toward the gray river below. And Daniel, I added quietly, I think it is finally time my son learns what his life actually costs. When Ethan picked me up from Daniel Harper's office that afternoon, I noticed immediately how carefully he studied my face. Children always search their parents for reassurance, even after they become adults. Maybe especially then. Everything all right? He asked as we pulled away from the curb downtown. I fastened my seatbelt slowly. Yes, I said calmly. Daniel was very helpful. Ethan relaxed slightly at that. I watched the tension leave his shoulders almost in real time. Funny how much comfort people find in believing you still trust them completely. The drive home passed quietly except for traffic reports humming softly through the radio speakers. Outside the car windows, late October rain had left the street slick and shining beneath gray skies. Hartford looked cold that afternoon. Sharp edges. Bare trees. People rushing along sidewalks with collars turned against the wind. I suddenly realized I no longer wanted to spend another winter inside Ethan's house pretending not to see the truth. That evening Vanessa served lemon herb salmon at the dining room table using the expensive china I had purchased for Ethan and Harold years earlier as a Christmas gift. The irony did not escape me. Dr. Reynolds says your wrist is healing nicely, she said pleasantly while pouring sparkling water into my glass. That is wonderful news. It is, I agreed. Ethan looked relieved. Maybe by Christmas you will be fully back on your feet. Back on my feet. The phrase lingered in my mind quietly while I cut small pieces of salmon I barely tasted. Because suddenly I understood something important. They did not actually want me helpless forever. Helplessness was expensive. What they wanted was control without responsibility. Dependence without inconvenience. The realization no longer hurt the way it once might have. It simply clarified things. The next morning, after Ethan left for work and Vanessa drove the children to school, I sat alone downstairs with my laptop open across my knees. Rain tapped softly against the small basement windows while the heating vents hummed overhead. For nearly 20 minutes, I stared at the banking screen without moving. Automatic transfers lined the page one beneath another like invisible threads connecting my life to theirs. Mortgage supplements. Vehicle leases. Tuition payments. Insurance adjustments. 11 years of quiet financial support disguised as maternal generosity. My finger hovered over the mouse. Then calmly, one by one, I began shutting everything down. The mortgage assistance transfer disappeared first. Then the tuition account. Then the luxury vehicle payment Vanessa probably assumed would continue forever. Some accounts required confirmation codes sent to my phone. Others required digital signatures Daniel had already prepared for me. The entire process felt strangely ordinary. No dramatic music. No tears. Just a 68-year-old woman quietly reclaiming ownership of her own life while rain fell steadily outside. By noon, every recurring transfer connected to Ethan and Vanessa had been frozen pending financial restructuring review. Daniel also transferred the remaining assets into a newly protected trust managed solely under my authorization. It took less than 2 hours to undo over a decade of dependency. I sat back afterward and looked around the small downstairs office. The room felt different somehow. Lighter. For the first time since the accident, I could breathe deeply without feeling that constant invisible pressure sitting against my chest. Around 3 o'clock, Vanessa returned home carrying shopping bags from an upscale boutique downtown. I heard her heels click sharply across the kitchen floor overhead before silence suddenly followed. Then came the sound of a cabinet door slamming. Ethan, she called loudly moments later even though he was not home. I remained downstairs quietly reading while muffled frustration drifted faintly through the ceiling. A few minutes later, footsteps moved quickly down the staircase. Vanessa appeared in the doorway holding her phone tightly. "Margaret," she said with forced politeness, Have you changed something with the accounts? I looked up from my book calmly. What do you mean? Her smile tightened immediately. The card linked to the household account was declined at the store. Household account. Such interesting language for money that never belonged to her in the first place. Oh, I said softly. Daniel is reviewing all expenditures right now. Vanessa blinked. Reviewing? At my age, I replied gently, I need to be careful financially. The irony nearly made me smile. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. This is really not a great time for disruptions. I closed my book slowly on my lap. There never seems to be a convenient time for the truth. She stared at me for several seconds then. Really stared. Perhaps for the first time since I arrived after the accident, Vanessa realized something fundamental had shifted. The weak, grateful older woman they expected was disappearing quietly in front of them. That evening Ethan came home nearly an hour early. I heard the garage door slam harder than usual before his footsteps crossed the kitchen rapidly overhead. Voices rose almost immediately afterward. Sharp whispers. Cabinet doors opening and closing. Then silence. A few minutes later Ethan appeared downstairs. His face looked pale beneath the hallway light. Mom, he began carefully, Vanessa said there were problems with the accounts today. I folded my reading glasses neatly beside me. Temporary changes. Ethan forced a small laugh. Well, the mortgage payment is scheduled tomorrow, so maybe Daniel can reverse whatever happened before then. I looked at my son quietly for a long moment. His expensive watch gleamed beneath the lamplight. The same watch I helped him purchase after his promotion 3 years earlier. No, I said softly. I do not think I will. Ethan's expression changed instantly then. Not grief. Not concern. Fear. Pure financial fear. And seeing it on my son's face hurt far less than I expected it would. The house felt different after that conversation. Quieter on the surface, but underneath the silence something sharp had begun unraveling. Ethan barely looked at me during breakfast the next morning. He sat at the kitchen island gripping a mug of black coffee while his phone buzzed repeatedly beside him. Every few minutes he rubbed his forehead or checked another message with growing irritation. Vanessa moved around the kitchen quickly, opening cabinets harder than necessary and slamming drawers without bothering to hide her frustration anymore. I do not understand why Daniel cannot simply restore the transfers temporarily, she said while stuffing papers into her oversized handbag. This is creating unnecessary problems. Ethan kept his eyes on the counter. I am handling it. Well, you better handle it quickly, Vanessa snapped. The mortgage company already emailed twice. I sat quietly at the table spreading strawberry jam onto toast as though none of it concerned me. It fascinated me how rapidly politeness disappears once money becomes uncertain. Only a week earlier Vanessa spoke to me with careful sweetness, the kind people use when protecting an investment. Now every word sounded brittle. Sharp around the edges. Around 11 o'clock, Ethan came downstairs while I was reading near the small basement window. He closed the office door behind him before speaking. Mom, can we talk? I set my book aside slowly. Of course. He remained standing instead of sitting. That alone told me how nervous he was. Ethan always stood when he felt cornered, as though movement might somehow restore control. I think there has been a misunderstanding, he began carefully. About the financial stuff. Financial stuff. Such small words for 11 years of dependence. Has there? I asked softly. He exhaled heavily. Mom, you know Vanessa and I never expected things to get this complicated. Complicated for whom? Ethan looked away briefly. That is not fair. No, I agreed quietly. It is not. Silence settled between us for several seconds. Upstairs I could hear the washing machine running faintly somewhere near the laundry room. Ordinary sounds. Domestic sounds. Yet Ethan looked at me like a businessman trying to negotiate a collapsing contract. You helped because you wanted to, he finally said. Nobody forced you. I stared at him quietly. Do you really believe that makes this better? His jaw tightened slightly. I am just saying you offered. Offered. The word landed strangely inside me because suddenly I remembered dozens of moments over the years when Ethan's requests arrived wrapped carefully inside guilt and obligation. The kids deserve stability right now, Mom. We are just trying to stay afloat. You know how hard things are these days. Always temporary. Always necessary. Always just enough to make saying no feel cruel. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. Do you know what hurts most? I asked. Ethan frowned slightly but said nothing. It is not the money. My voice remained steady. It is realizing your first reaction after my accident was not fear for me. It was fear for what would happen if the payments stopped. Ethan's face changed instantly then. That is not true. Is it not? He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came immediately. And sometimes silence tells you everything. Ethan finally sat down across from me looking suddenly exhausted. Older somehow. You do not understand the pressure I am under, he muttered quietly. Pressure. I repeated softly. Ethan, your father and I worked 2 jobs for years to pay our mortgage. We skipped vacations. We drove used cars. We survived recessions without asking anyone to rescue us. His expression hardened slightly. Things are different now. No, I said gently. Values are different now. The room became very still after that. Ethan leaned back in the chair rubbing both hands across his face. For the first time since the accident, he looked less angry than frightened. If the transfers stay frozen, we could lose the house, he admitted quietly. There it was. Finally. Not concern for our relationship. Not regret. The house. The lifestyle. The payments. I felt an unexpected sadness then. Not because Ethan needed help, but because he seemed incapable of understanding how deeply he had traded love for entitlement without noticing the difference. Do you remember the little yellow house on Hawthorne Street? I asked suddenly. Ethan looked confused. What? The first house your father and I bought. He blinked slowly. Barely. I smiled faintly at the memory. The roof leaked every spring. Your father patched it himself because we could not afford repairs. We ate macaroni and canned soup for nearly 2 years while saving money. Ethan looked down at the floor silently. But we were happy, I continued softly. Because everything we had belonged to us. He looked up then, something uncertain flickering briefly across his face. Guilt perhaps. Or shame. But before either feeling could settle fully, Vanessa's voice echoed sharply from upstairs. Ethan, the bank is on the phone again. Instantly the moment disappeared. Ethan stood too quickly, tension returning to his body like a reflex. He looked at me one final time before reaching for the doorknob. Mom, he said quietly, I really need you to reconsider this. I watched him carefully for a long moment. The expensive sweater. The polished shoes. The wedding ring Harold once proudly paid to resize after Ethan inherited it. Then I nodded slowly. I already have, I replied. And for the first time since my accident, I realized something with complete certainty. My son did not actually want his mother back. He wanted the life my money provided. And those were not the same thing at all. 3 days later, I left Ethan's house before sunrise. The neighborhood was still quiet when the car service Daniel arranged pulled into the driveway beneath a pale gray sky. Autumn leaves scattered across the damp pavement while cold air drifted through the open trunk as the driver loaded my suitcases carefully inside. I stood beside the curb holding my coat closed at the collar and looked at the house one final time. The tall windows. The stone walkway. The expensive landscaping Harold would have considered unnecessary. For years I believed helping Ethan buy that house meant securing his future. Now I understood it had only delayed something much deeper. Accountability. The front door opened just before I climbed into the car. Ethan stepped outside wearing jeans and a dark sweater, his expression strained from too many sleepless nights. He stopped halfway down the walkway when he saw the luggage already packed. "You are leaving?" he asked quietly. "Yes." He looked genuinely startled by that. Perhaps he assumed the argument would continue indefinitely. Perhaps he believed mothers simply endure forever. "Where are you going?" "Maine," I answered calmly. "For a while." Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets against the cold. "Mom, we should talk before you make dramatic decisions." Dramatic. Another interesting word. I almost smiled. "I have spent years avoiding dramatic decisions," I said softly. "That is how we ended up here." He looked away briefly toward the street before speaking again. "Vanessa is upset." "I know. The mortgage company is threatening penalties if we miss another payment." There it was again. Not "I will miss you." Not "I am sorry." Always the house. The bills. The money. I studied my son quietly beneath the dim morning light. He looked exhausted now in ways expensive clothes could not hide. Older than 39. Frightened. And for the first time since this began, I felt something close to peace instead of anger. Because once illusions die, clarity arrives very quickly afterward. "Do you remember what you said at the hospital?" I asked gently. Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You told Vanessa assisted living might be better for everyone." His face tightened immediately. "Mom, no," I interrupted softly. "Let me finish." The cold wind lifted strands of silver hair across my face while I looked at the son I once believed would always protect me. "I spent weeks thinking the accident changed everything," I said quietly. "But the truth is, it only revealed what was already there." Ethan swallowed hard but said nothing. "You stopped seeing me as your mother long before I stopped sending money," I continued. "The accident simply made it harder for you to pretend otherwise." He looked genuinely wounded then. "That is not fair." "Is it not?" My voice remained calm. "Tell me honestly, Ethan. If I had no savings, no investments, no ability to help financially anymore, would you still have invited me into this house after the accident?" Silence settled between us instantly. Heavy silence. The kind no parent ever wants from their child. Ethan opened his mouth once, then closed it again. His eyes drifted toward the driveway instead of meeting mine. And there it was. The answer. Not spoken. But unmistakably there. I nodded slowly to myself. I think we both needed honesty more than comfort. Ethan's expression crumpled slightly then, not with cruelty but with something sadder. Weakness. Entitlement had settled into his life so gradually he no longer recognized it as dependence. "I never meant for things to become like this," he admitted quietly. "I know." And strangely enough, I believed him. Most betrayals inside families are not born from evil. They grow slowly from convenience. From selfishness left unchallenged. From taking and taking until gratitude quietly disappears altogether. The driver closed the trunk gently behind me. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked faintly while sprinklers hissed across neighboring lawns. Ordinary suburban sounds. Life continuing exactly as it always does, even when your heart changes completely. Ethan stepped closer then, his voice softer now. "What happens next?" I looked past him toward the front windows of the house. Vanessa stood partially hidden behind the curtain in the dining room watching us. She disappeared immediately when our eyes almost met. That depends on you, I answered. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? I pulled my gloves slowly over my hands. It means if you ever want a relationship with me again, it cannot be built on transactions. He looked down at the driveway silently. I do love you, Mom. The words hurt more than anger would have. Because somewhere deep beneath all the entitlement and excuses, I believed he meant them. But love without respect eventually becomes something selfish. Something hungry. I stepped closer and touched his arm gently. Then learn how to love people before you need something from them. Ethan's eyes filled slightly, though he quickly looked away. I climbed into the back seat before either of us said anything else. As the car pulled slowly away from the curb, I looked out the window at my son standing alone in the driveway of the house I had spent years helping him keep. He looked smaller somehow. Lost. But for the first time in a very long while, I did not feel responsible for fixing that feeling inside him. The drive north toward Maine stretched quietly beneath cloudy skies and endless rows of autumn trees burning orange and gold across the hillsides. Somewhere near the New Hampshire border, sunlight finally broke through the clouds in thin pale streaks across the ocean. I rolled down the window slightly and breathed in cold salt air drifting inland from the coast. The accident had fractured my wrist. But losing the illusion of who my son had become had fractured something far more important. Still, as the waves appeared beside the highway and the horizon widened ahead of me, I realized something unexpected. Broken things can heal differently than they were before. Stronger sometimes. Clearer. And for the first time in years, my life finally belonged to me again.